The island was as desolate as the whispers of its history. Tucked away in the northernmost reaches of Europe, it had long been forgotten by maps, hidden beneath a veil of mist that never seemed to lift. Its craggy cliffs met the churning sea below, where the waves crashed with a violent fury that seemed to warn anyone who might dare to approach. Yet, a group of 6 friends, unfamiliar with its grim reputation, had set sail for adventure, hoping to escape the mundane and find something extraordinary. It was supposed to be a break from their routine lives, a weekend of camping, exploration, and mystery. They had no idea that they were about to stumble upon something far darker than they could imagine. "Are we sure we should be here?" Emma asked, her voice betraying a hint of unease as she surveyed the dense, shadowy forest that stretched before them. Her fingers wrapped nervously around the strap of her backpack. "Relax," Mark, the group's leader, said with a grin, his tone light. "It's just an abandoned island. No one's been here in ages. What's the worst that could happen?" The group laughed nervously, but there was a tension in the air, something neither Mark nor anyone else could ignore. They made their way down the rocky path, the trees casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in the low light of the setting sun. The island felt wrong in a way that was difficult to define. As the evening descended, the forest gave way to a narrow beach. The sands were dark, almost black, and the moon hung high above them like an omen, its light glowing eerily as it bathed the landscape in an unsettling hue. But it was the stone that caught their attention. There, half buried at the edge of the tide, was a colossal stone. It was the shape of an eye, its surface smooth and unnaturally perfect, with lines that spiraled outward like the intricate patterns of a forgotten ritual. The stone's size dwarfed everything around it, and for a moment the group stood frozen, mesmerized by its presence. "What the hell is this?" Noah asked, taking a hesitant step forward. The others followed suit, drawn to the stone by a pull they couldn't explain. "It's like an eye," Emma murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "But it's so big. Why would something like this be here?" "I don't know," Mark said, kneeling beside it. "But it looks like it's been here for centuries." A strange energy seemed to hum from the stone, a pulse that reverberated through the air. The group was too entranced by its otherworldly presence to question it further. The moon, now fully risen, illuminated the stone in a ghostly glow. As the light touched its surface, something happened. The stone began to shimmer, the spiral patterns rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. The air grew colder, the wind picking up, howling through the trees. And then, with a crackling sound, images began to appear within the stone's surface. Images of places and events that seemed impossibly foreign. A man drenched in blood, his face twisted in agony. A woman standing in front of a burning house, her eyes vacant. A child running through a forest, the shadows of something unseen chasing him. The images shifted so quickly that it was hard to keep track, all flashing too fast for any of them to process. The group stood in stunned silence, each of them gripped by a sense of dread that seemed to tighten around their hearts. "What is this?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. She stepped forward and reached out, fingers barely brushing the stone's surface. In that instant, a shockwave of energy surged through the air. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the night was shattered by an eerie, unnatural sound, a low, grinding noise as if the earth itself was opening. Sophie cried out, but before anyone could react, her body was yanked forward, as if pulled by invisible hands. The others rushed to grab her, but it was too late. She was drawn into the stone, her form disappearing into the glowing eye. "No!" Mark shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the deafening roar of the stone's energy. They tried to run toward her, but the air around them thickened, pressing against their chests, making each step a struggle. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything went still. The group stood at the edge of the stone, breathless and wide-eyed. But Sophie was gone. A chilling silence settled over them, broken only by the whispering winds that seemed to speak in a language they didn't understand. "We need to get her back," Emma said, her voice firm despite the terror in her eyes. "Whatever that was, we need to fix it." They could feel it now, time was no longer the same. The world around them seemed to bend, the moon above now hung in a strange, impossible angle, casting shadows that didn't match the trees. Something had changed and they had no idea how to undo it. But one thing was clear, the stone was a doorway. And the only way to save Sophie, and themselves, was to walk through it. The moon, once a bright beacon of comfort, had become an ominous specter looming overhead, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched like dark fingers reaching toward them. The stone was still there, silent and glowing, but it no longer looked like a simple object. It had become something far more malevolent, a portal into a place they couldn't yet comprehend. Mark was the first to move. He stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest as if it, too, was being drawn into the stone's gravity. He reached out, his fingers brushing against its cold surface, and immediately felt a shock of icy energy shoot up his arm. He recoiled, heart racing. "No, we can't just go in," Emma said, her voice breaking with fear. She grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him back. "What if we're not even alive anymore? What if we're trapped?" Mark looked at her, his expression grim, his mind swirling with doubts. He could hear the terror in her voice, but he also knew they had no choice. Sophie was gone, and the stone was the only way to reach her. They had to try. "There's no other choice," Mark said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at his insides. "We have to find her." The others gathered around the stone, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear. Noah, the most skeptical of the group, looked at the glowing surface with dread. "You really think this is going to work?" he muttered. "What if it's a trap? What if this is all some kind of—" But before he could finish, the stone pulsed with a violent surge, and a loud crack echoed through the air. The surface of the stone began to ripple again, and the sky itself seemed to shift, the clouds swirling into unnatural shapes. A gust of wind swept across the beach, carrying with it a strange, dissonant melody, soft at first but growing louder, like the wailing of some unseen creature. The sound was both beautiful and grotesque, like a lullaby sung by a ghost. It seemed to come from the very heart of the island, drawing them in, making their limbs feel heavy and their thoughts foggy. "Do you hear that?" Sophie's voice echoed in Mark's mind, soft and distant, as if coming from another world. "Sophie?" he whispered, but no one else heard. The sound of the wind intensified, and the stone seemed to come alive, its spiral patterns glowing brighter. Mark gritted his teeth and stepped forward again. "We have no choice." Without another word, he placed both hands on the surface of the stone, and the world around them collapsed into darkness. For a split second there was nothing, just emptiness, cold and suffocating. Then the darkness fractured into millions of tiny shards, and the group was violently hurled through a tunnel of swirling lights and sounds. Time seemed to warp, stretching and bending in ways that defied logic. Their stomachs twisted in nausea as they were pulled forward, unable to stop, unable to understand what was happening. And then, as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. They tumbled into the dirt, coughing and gasping for breath. The world around them was completely different. It was no longer the quiet beach they had been standing on. Instead, they found themselves in a forest, a dense, dark forest, where the trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching like skeletal hands toward the black sky. The air was thick with an unnatural fog that seemed to swallow everything, even the moonlight. Mark struggled to his feet, his body aching from the brutal journey. He looked around in disbelief. Where are we?" No one answered. They were all too stunned to speak. But Emma, trembling, pointed toward the edge of the forest. There, just beyond the trees, was a figure, a woman standing still as if waiting for them. Her face was obscured by her long, flowing hair, but there was something unnerving about the way she stood, her posture rigid, like a marionette held in place by invisible strings. "Sophie?" Mark called, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's head snapped up, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark, the pupils elongated and unnaturally large, like those of an animal. A sharp, chilling smile stretched across her face, and for a moment, it seemed as though time itself froze. But then the world around them shifted once more. The forest started to distort, the trees bending at impossible angles, the ground pulsing beneath their feet like a living entity. The air grew thick with a foul, suffocating smell, like rotting meat and decayed leaves. "Stay together," Mark shouted, grabbing Emma's arm as the others scrambled to follow. They turned, only to be confronted by more figures emerging from the fog. Shadows, indistinct and shifting, seemed to take form as they moved toward the group. Each figure was different, some tall, others short, some with grotesque, distorted faces, others with no faces at all. They whispered, their voices a blend of agony and sorrow, their words unintelligible but filled with malice. "We have to keep moving," Noah muttered, his face pale as he backed away from the approaching figures. But as they moved forward, the landscape continued to shift, becoming more nightmarish with each step. The trees twisted into jagged forms, their bark blackened and charred, and the ground beneath their feet was no longer solid, but a swirling mass of black liquid. The sky above them cracked open, revealing a vast, endless expanse of swirling darkness, like a hole in the fabric of reality itself. And then, from the depths of the darkness came a voice a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice hissed, its tone filled with ancient hatred. "You cannot escape." Mark froze, his blood turning to ice. Who are you?" The voice laughed, a horrible sound that echoed through the forest, shaking the trees. "I am the keeper of this place. I am the one who watches, the one who waits. And now you are mine." Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet cracked open, and black tendrils shot out, wrapping around their legs, pulling them downward into the abyss. Mark tried to fight, to break free, but the tendrils were too strong, dragging him toward the darkness. "No!" he screamed, but the words were swallowed by the overwhelming silence that followed. The last thing he saw before he was pulled under was Sophie's face, her expression twisted in agony, her eyes pleading for help. And then everything went black. The darkness consumed them, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. The last sound Mark heard was the frantic, distant cries of his friends, and then there was nothing, only cold, oppressive silence. He could feel the black tendrils tightening around his body, dragging him downward, deeper into the earth. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. It was as if the air itself had turned to lead, heavy and impossible to breathe. Then with a sudden jolt, the pulse stopped. Mark's body slammed into something solid. He gasped, the breath rushing back into his lungs, though his chest felt tight with an unnatural pressure. His hands scrambled for purchase as he struggled to stand, his eyes desperately searching through the impenetrable darkness. And then a light appeared. At first it was just a faint glimmer in the distance, but it grew brighter, drawing him toward it. The shadows seemed to recoil from it as if they feared the light. He wasn't sure if it was hope or madness that urged him forward, but he knew one thing: he had to move. He stood, shaking, and began to walk toward the light. With each step, the oppressive silence around him deepened, as though the very world was holding its breath. The shadows of the forest loomed like dark sentinels on either side, their shapes barely visible in the dark. As Mark drew closer to the light, the source of it revealed itself. A massive, twisted tree, its bark glowing faintly like pale moonlight. At its base was an ancient, stone doorway, cracked and weathered, but still standing. The light seemed to emanate from the space between the stones, a faint pulse of energy that made Mark's skin tingle. The air around the doorway felt different, charged as if something ancient and powerful lay just beyond it. But before Mark could take another step, a soft sound reached his ears. A whisper. It was Sophie's voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable. Mark, help me." The voice trembled, full of fear. Mark's heart clenched in his chest. He had to reach her. He had to save her. He stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorway. The moment his fingers brushed against the stone, the light blazed brighter, blinding him. The ground shook violently beneath his feet, and the air itself seemed to ripple with unseen forces. "Mark." Sophie's voice again, more urgent this time. "Don't open it. Don't come through." But it was too late. The stone had already begun to shift, groaning as it opened, revealing the twisted, black void beyond. Mark stepped through without hesitation, his mind set on finding Sophie. On the other side he found himself in a place unlike any he had ever seen. A vast, desolate wasteland stretching endlessly in all directions. The sky above was a sickly shade of green, swirling with clouds that moved in unnatural patterns. The ground beneath his feet was cracked and jagged, as though it had been torn apart by some immense force. As he looked around he saw them, figures moving in the distance. Tall, cloaked shadows that seemed to watch him with eyes that gleamed like molten fire. The figures were all around him now, circling, but they made no sound. They simply watched, their eyes unblinking and ever-present. Mark's pulse quickened, and he realized, with a cold shiver running down his spine, that these were not people. They were something else, something ancient. Something that had existed long before humanity had ever walked this earth. "Sophie!" Mark shouted, his voice cracking as he scanned the horizon. "Sophie, where are you?" The wind shifted, and with it came a distant laugh, low and haunting. It echoed across the barren landscape, reverberating in his skull like the sound of 1,000 voices all speaking in unison. "You should not have come here," the voice whispered, now clearer, as if it were speaking directly into his mind. "You have entered my domain, and now you belong to me." The figures began to move closer, their presence growing heavier, their eyes burning brighter. Mark's heart raced, and he felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. These things, whatever they were, weren't merely watching him. They were waiting for something. Suddenly he heard a soft cry, faint and distant. It was Sophie's voice, but this time it was different. It wasn't filled with fear but with something darker, something that made Mark's blood run cold. "Sophie!" Mark shouted again, his voice desperate. "Please, where are you?" The cry came again, this time louder, clearer. He turned toward the sound, pushing through the dense fog that now surrounded him. As he stumbled forward, his foot caught on something, a stone half buried in the cracked earth. He bent down to pull it free, but the moment his fingers touched it, a jolt of pain shot through his body, like electricity coursing through his veins. He gasped, but the pain was not from the stone. It was from something deeper, something inside him. His vision blurred, and for a moment, the world around him spun in dizzying circles. He saw flashes, images of the past, of a time before he and his friends had ever come to the island. He saw a woman, Sophie, but she was not the Sophie he knew. This version of her was standing at the foot of an altar, her face pale and lifeless. The image shifted, and now she was in a forest, her eyes wide with terror, reaching out to him for help. "No," Mark whispered, staggering back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "This isn't real." But the vision continued. Sophie's face twisted in agony, and then, there was something else. Something behind her, lurking in the shadows. A figure watching, waiting. A figure with eyes like black holes, endless and devouring. Mark's heart stopped. He knew that figure. It was the same one he had seen in the stone, the one whose gaze seemed to pierce through everything, even time itself. The voice spoke again, this time with a terrible finality. "She belongs to me now," it hissed. "And so do you." The ground beneath Mark's feet began to tremble again, and the shadows began to close in. The figures were upon him now, their eyes fixed on him with malevolent intent. Mark had no time to think, no time to react. He turned and ran, the eerie whispers of the shadows trailing behind him, the twisted trees and cracked earth seeming to close in with each step. Somewhere in the distance, he heard Sophie's voice again, but it was no longer a cry for help. It was a whisper, soft, seductive, and terrifying. "Mark, come to me, it's too late, you can never leave." And just like that, Mark knew the truth. He was no longer in control. The island had claimed him, and it would never let him go. Mark's legs were burning, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. The whispering shadows were closing in, their voices growing louder with every step, wrapping around his mind like a shroud of madness. He could hear them all now, dozens of voices speaking in a language he didn't understand, yet somehow he felt the weight of their words pressing against his skull. "Come to us, come into the fold." The wind howled as he stumbled through the treacherous terrain, his footfalls muffled by the thick fog. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest tight with fear. There was no escape. He could feel it in his bones, the island had him. The stone had brought him here, and now it would not let him go. He couldn't even hear the others anymore. Sophie's voice, too, had faded into the oppressive silence. It was as if the island had devoured everything, every trace of their existence, leaving only the dark, endless expanse around him. The distant glow of the strange, twisted tree was now completely obscured by the growing shadows, and Mark could no longer tell which direction he was running in. His heart pounded against his ribcage like a wild animal trapped in a cage. A sudden chill swept over him, colder than anything he had ever felt before. It sliced through his clothing, cutting straight to his bones. Mark faltered, gasping, and then froze as he saw them. The figures. They were standing just beyond the fog, their forms more defined now. Tall, thin silhouettes that towered over him. They weren't human, not anymore. Their limbs were unnaturally long, their faces obscured by tattered, flowing robes that seemed to absorb the very light around them. But it wasn't their shapes that terrified Mark, it was their eyes. Their eyes glowed with an ethereal, unholy light. Hollow, endless pits of blackness, as though there was nothing behind them. Nothing but a void. Yet somehow Mark felt them watching him, every thought, every movement, every breath. The figures moved toward him, their heads tilting in perfect unison, as if they were studying him, watching him. But it wasn't curiosity in their gaze. It was something far worse, something akin to recognition. As if they had been waiting for him. "No," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "No, please. Stay away from me." But they didn't listen. They never listened. The leader of the figures stepped forward, its form towering over Mark. The others followed, their footsteps silent, their eyes unblinking. The leader reached out with one long skeletal hand, its fingers impossibly thin, yet strong like a vice. Mark tried to back away, but his legs felt like lead. He couldn't move. He was trapped in their gaze, unable to look away, as if the eyes were pulling him in. The cold, suffocating weight of their presence pressed down on him, making it harder to breathe. "You've come far, mortal," the figure's voice rasped, low and hollow as if it came from somewhere deep within the earth itself. "Farther than most." Mark's throat went dry. He couldn't speak. His body felt paralyzed, frozen in place, while the figures circled around him, their eyes burning into him with a maddening intensity. "But you are too late," the figure continued, its voice echoing around Mark, wrapping around him like chains. "This place does not belong to you. It never has." Mark's mind reeled as the figure's words sank in. The weight of them crushed him, pushing him deeper into the pit of despair. What do you want from us?" "From me?" His voice was barely a whisper. The figure's hollow eyes flickered with something that could have been amusement. "You think you are different, that you can escape, but you are all the same. You are all destined to belong here, to become part of this place." Mark could feel something moving inside of him, a terrible, gnawing sensation like his very soul was being torn apart. It felt as if the island itself were reaching into him, pulling at the fabric of his existence. He gritted his teeth and tried to fight, but the darkness was too powerful. "Let me go," Mark begged, his voice raw with desperation. "Please, I just want to go home. I just want to leave." The figure's laughter was hollow, as cold and endless as the void. "There is no home for you anymore," it whispered. "There is no escape." The shadows around him seemed to respond, closing in, becoming thick and suffocating. Mark's heart thundered in his chest, but he couldn't breathe. He was drowning in the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of ancient rot that seemed to come from the very soil beneath his feet. And then he saw it. In the distance, through the fog, a flicker of light, faint, fragile. It was Sophie. Her face was pale, her eyes empty, but she was moving toward him, or perhaps toward something else, something behind him. Mark's breath hitched. She was real, she had to be real. "Sophie!" he screamed, his voice breaking. He pushed forward toward her, desperate. The figures surrounding him did not move to stop him. Instead, they watched, their hollow eyes fixed on his every move. "Sophie, please!" he cried, his voice shaking with panic. But as he drew closer, Sophie's form began to distort. Her features flickered like a mirage in the heat. One moment she was standing there, her face twisted in agony, and the next she was nothing but a shadow, her outline melting into the fog. "No. No!" Mark yelled, reaching out, but his hand passed right through her. She was gone. And then the island spoke. Its voice was not like the figures, it was more like the wind itself, rising from the very earth. "She is not here," the island whispered, a voice both ancient and endless. "You've seen what you were meant to see. The truth. The stone calls you now, Mark. The stone has chosen you." The ground beneath him shifted, cracks spreading through the earth like veins of a broken body. Mark's knees buckled and he collapsed to the ground, his mind spinning, his heart pounding. He couldn't escape. He couldn't save Sophie. There was no way out. The whispers of the figures filled his mind, their voices twisting and tangling into a single unified cry. "Join us. Become one with the island. Become one with the endless dark." And in that moment, Mark realized something he hadn't understood before. This place didn't just trap them. It consumed them. Their souls, their memories, their very essence, it all fed the island. And he had already been marked. Bandanoi. Mark's breath was shallow, his body trembling as the ground quaked beneath him. The whispers of the figures grew louder, their voices blending into a maddening chorus that clawed at his mind. He could feel his thoughts fraying, unraveling, like threads being pulled apart by invisible hands. His heart raced, each beat like a drum pounding in his ears. He wanted to scream, but no sound escaped. The island was swallowing him whole. The fog pressed closer, thickening, suffocating. The figures stood at the edges of his vision, their hollow eyes boring into him, never blinking, never moving. They were not just watching him now, they were inside his mind, inside his very soul. And then, the voice of the island spoke again, this time softer, more intimate, as if it were whispering directly into his thoughts. "You think you are the first to resist," it crooned. "You are the first to fight but not the last. This island has claimed many and it will claim you as well. You are no different." Mark's chest tightened as the truth of those words sank in. He was trapped. There was no escape. There never had been. The island wasn't just a place, it was a living, breathing entity, and it had marked him the moment his hand had touched the cursed stone. He tried to stand, his legs shaky beneath him, but the ground seemed to pull at him, dragging him down like quicksand. The air around him grew colder, impossibly cold, as though the island itself was feeding on his fear, growing stronger with each passing second. He could feel the weight of its presence, its power pressing against him, holding him in place. A cold wind stirred, carrying with it a sound that made his blood run cold, a soft, distant song. It was the same song he had heard when he first arrived on the island, faint and haunting, a melody that seemed to echo from deep within the earth itself. It wrapped around him like a lullaby, but there was nothing comforting about it. It was the sound of something ancient, something terrible. Sophie's voice, too, seemed to join in the song. Her voice, once filled with fear, now sounded almost serene. But it was not the Sophie he knew. It was something else, something twisted, something that had already been consumed by the island. "Mark," the voice whispered, her tone soft, almost gentle. "Come to me, it's time to let go, time to surrender." Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he turned, his eyes desperately searching the fog for her. He saw nothing but shadows, indistinct and shifting, swirling like smoke. The song grew louder, more insistent, pulling him toward it, like a thread wrapped around his soul. He could feel the pull of it, like gravity drawing him in, suffocating him. "No," he gasped, shaking his head, trying to push the thoughts away. "Sophie, you're not here. This isn't real." But deep down Mark knew the truth. It was real. This was happening. This island was no dream, no nightmare. It was a place where time and space twisted, where the dead still wandered and the living were consumed. It had been waiting for them, waiting for him. The fog parted for a brief moment, and in the distance Mark saw it, an immense, dark structure towering against the twisted, green sky. It was an ancient temple, its stone walls cracked and weathered by centuries of neglect. The entrance was a gaping maw, an archway carved with symbols Mark couldn't understand, swirling patterns that seemed to move on their own, shifting and changing with every passing second. It was calling him. The island wanted him to enter, to step into the heart of it. Mark's mind screamed for him to run. But his body didn't listen. The song was louder now, and his feet were moving of their own accord, carrying him toward the temple, his legs heavy as if they were no longer his own. He stumbled toward the entrance, the walls closing in around him as the whispers grew louder, as though the very stones were speaking to him, urging him to enter. "Come inside," the voice of the island murmured almost seductively. "There is nothing left to fear here. Only truth. Only understanding. Step into the dark, Mark, and you will see the past, the future. Everything." Mark hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the temple. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The walls seemed to close in around him, narrow and claustrophobic. His heart thudded in his chest as he moved deeper into the temple, the shadows growing darker with every step. The floor beneath him was uneven, cracked stones that felt as though they could give way at any moment. The walls were adorned with faded murals depicting strange, twisted figures, beings that were neither human nor animal. Their eyes, black and empty, seemed to follow Mark's every move, watching him, judging him. In the center of the temple stood a massive stone altar, covered in symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. It was ancient, older than the island itself. And above the altar, a large stone, just like the one on the beach, was embedded in the wall. The stone pulsed with an eerie, green light. Mark's stomach churned. He knew what this was. The altar. The heart of the island. The place where it all began. As he approached the altar, the stone began to glow brighter, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. The song grew louder still, filling his head, drowning out all other sound. It was overwhelming, like the voices of 1,000 souls, all crying out at once. "Sophie," he whispered, his voice breaking as he reached out toward the stone. "Where are you?" His fingers brushed against the surface of the stone, and in that instant the world around him shattered. The altar disappeared. The temple collapsed into darkness. And Mark found himself standing in the center of an abyss, surrounded by endless blackness. The air was thick, suffocating, as though he were drowning in nothingness. And then he saw them. Figures, tall and hunched, emerging from the shadows. Their faces were hidden behind veils of darkness, but their eyes, they were everywhere, watching him, judging him. The hollow eyes of the island's ancient inhabitants. The ones who had been lost to it long ago. "Welcome, Mark," the voice of the island murmured, its presence heavy and oppressive. "You have come to understand. You have come to become one of us." The ground beneath him cracked open, and the figures began to advance, their eyes gleaming in the dark. And Mark knew with a chilling certainty that there was no escape. There never had been. The abyss swallowed him whole. Mark felt as if he were being torn apart, not physically but mentally, emotionally, as though his very essence was being disassembled piece by piece. The figures around him closed in, their eyes multiplying until they seemed to fill every inch of the void. Their hollow gaze was unrelenting, unblinking, and it tore at the fabric of his mind. "Become one of us, Mark," the island's voice whispered, now clear and sharp, like the final breath of something long dead. "You are not the first to resist, and you will not be the last. We are timeless, and so shall you be. Forever." Mark's heart hammered in his chest as he reached for the stone again, his hand trembling. The cold stone felt alive beneath his fingertips, pulsing with an energy that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. It was calling to him, urging him to surrender, to become a part of the island, to slip into the eternal darkness and be forgotten by time. But Mark resisted. For the first time since stepping onto the island, he understood what he had to do. The truth was as sharp as a knife, cutting through the fog of his fear. He was not meant to be here. He was not meant to stay. He thought of Sophie, her voice twisted by the island, but somewhere deep in his mind, he knew she wasn't truly lost. She had been taken, consumed by this place, but she hadn't truly vanished. If he could break the cycle, if he could escape. "No," he shouted, forcing himself to turn away from the stone. "I won't let you take me." The shadows recoiled as if struck, their form flickering and distorting. The figures seemed confused, their hollow eyes narrowing, but they did not stop. They advanced with a slow, deliberate pace, their presence a weight that pressed in on him, making it hard to breathe. But Mark was done running. He could hear the song, yes. It was still there, wrapping around him like chains. But now he could hear something else, a faint echo, a voice that wasn't from the island. "Sophie," the word slipped from his lips, weak at first, but it grew stronger. "Sophie." The island trembled. The shadows recoiled. And for the briefest moment, Mark saw it, the truth beneath the surface. Sophie's face, not twisted, not hollow, but alive, shining through the darkness. She was still there. She had always been there. The figures paused, their eyes shifting, their movements jerking in unnatural spasms. It was as if they were confused, as if something had disrupted the balance they had so carefully constructed. The very fabric of the island began to warp, the stone altar cracking and splitting like a dying beast. Then, with a sudden and overwhelming surge of energy, Mark did the only thing he could do. He stepped forward, into the heart of the darkness. And in that moment, everything shattered. The figures collapsed into mist, their presence evaporating like smoke. The stone that had pulsed with such overwhelming power crumbled to dust. The song ceased. The island was quiet. Mark opened his eyes, and when he did, he found himself standing in the place he had once begun, the beach. The air was warm, the sun casting long shadows over the sand. The waves crashed softly against the shore. The island no longer loomed in the distance, dark and brooding. It was gone. Sophie stood beside him, her face filled with quiet sorrow, but her eyes were alive. They were no longer those hollow eyes, the eyes of the island. They were human again. "Mark," she said softly, "you did it. You saved us." Mark's heart thudded in his chest. He looked around, but everything felt different, familiar yet distant, like something he had dreamed about, something he had only half remembered. The island was gone, but the memories still clung to him, sharp and biting. "We're free," he whispered, but there was a sadness in his voice, a hollow echo that he couldn't shake. Sophie reached out and touched his arm gently. "We're free, Mark. But some things never truly let go." And with that, the world around him began to blur. The edges of reality bent and twisted, as if the very fabric of time was warping. The beach, the sun, Sophie, all of it began to fade. Mark reached out, but it was too late. The world collapsed into darkness once more. When Mark awoke, he was back in his room. The familiar walls of his apartment surrounded him, the hum of the city outside barely audible. His heart was racing, his breath coming in sharp gasps as he sat up in bed, drenched in sweat. The nightmare, the island, the stone, Sophie, had all felt so real, so vivid. But now, as the darkness of the night settled around him, he realized something. It had not been a nightmare. He walked over to his desk, his hands trembling as he reached for his journal. It was open to a page, the ink still fresh. "The island awaits, it always does. And those who listen never return." The words were his own. But Mark knew deep down that he was no longer sure what was real and what was not. The island had left a mark on him, on his soul, and he knew no matter how far he ran, it would never truly let him go. The darkness had claimed him. And now the song would always echo in the back of his mind. This is a work of fiction, a tale woven from the dark corners of the imagination.